Hi everybody. So I am re-recording this abridged version of the lesson that we had on Friday. So yeah, here it is. So we're going to be learning JS today, and JS is a coding language that allows you to turn your static web page, i.e., a web page that doesn't do anything, into a reactive web page, which is a web page that can change depending on an input. It can give you an output depending on an input that you have. So one of the core fundamentals in JS are variables. So variables, just like in algebra, can be uh, just a value that you don't know. So instead of an algebra where it's just a number, in JS they can be a number, a bunch of numbers, like a list of numbers. You can have hash maps, which are pretty much linking keys, kind of, to other variables. So like linking two things together. You have just regular numbers. You have characters. You have strings of characters, pretty much words and sentences. Um, and so there are many different types of variables that you can have in coding in general. So specifically to JS, there are 6 different types of basic primitive variables, and they are Boolean, null, undefined, number, big int, string, and symbol. So these are kind of vague, actually. So pretty much we really don't need to know any of these. Actually, before I was researching for today, I did not know any of these, truth be told, and I doubt that you're really going to need these unless you're coding professionally. So, this is just basic variables for every coding language. First, we have the int. An int is any whole number. It can be negative or positive, ranging from about negative 2 billion to about positive 2 billion. One feature of an int in some coding languages, such as JS or Java or C, I believe, is that they'll actually wrap around. So if you have it exceed this maximum limit right here, 2,147,000,000 and change, it'll actually wrap around to go to negative 2,147,000,000. So that is something that you might want to be aware of if it ever happens to you. This personally never happened to me. I've never had that problem. Uh, so Yeah, it's just something you need to be aware of. Integers cannot store decimal values. That is something that you need to be aware of. A boolean. A boolean is pretty much just true or false. That's it. Char is character, and which is a single letter. So uh, think of just like the letter A. You can have Q, W, M, or it could be space. Um, your spacebar would be space separator. Enter would be line separator, and enter tab would be paragraph separator. So you really only need to worry about space separator. The other ones are just pretty obscure things that you don't really need to know. Float is a number with decimals. Um, it is only accurate up to 7 decimal places, so that is something you need to be aware of. Uh, and yeah, that's all that it is. You have double. It is double the size of a float, so it is significantly larger, and it'll take a longer time for your computer to process. And it is accurate up to 15 decimal places. So you might want to use it when you're really worried about precision, but other than that, I'd recommend you use a float because you don't want to bog down your computer with unnecessary doubles because your float is 32 bits, so it's 32 values of zeros and ones, but a double is 64, so that is significantly larger. And once you have a lot of these, if you're creating a bunch of these, for example, if you're like just looping over and over creating doubles, it can really slow down your computer. Optimization is a big part of coding. Along. Long is like an int, but maximum and minimum is 2 to the 63. Uh, that's pretty much it. A byte is 8 bits. So a bit is just one value of 0 or 1. It's just one cell. And a byte is 8 of these. So if you hear, like, for example, someone use this computer has, like, can process this many bytes per second, which is pretty slow if you're just using bytes. You should use megabytes or gigabytes. Uh, that would be 8 bits. So that's something to be aware of. They have a minimum of negative 120 and a maximum of 127. And how do you create these variables? Well, you use var. So how the syntax works over here is you type in var, and then the name of the variable. So for example, this would be x, and then equals, and then your value, and then semicolon. So if you want to have a character, you just type in quotes, and then the character. If you want to use a boolean, you just type true in this value space instead of 1. And if you want to have like a float or a long, I believe it'll automatically assign it. Or actually, I don't think JS has a distinction between the two. Uh, so this is really you only need another distinction if you're coding in Java when you get to high school. So JS will actually automatically assign variables, which is very useful actually. Same with Python. Python also does this. It is, I think there is still a way to initialize variables yourself if you. I'm actually not sure, but mostly you don't really need to worry about. You just need to worry about. You don't need to worry about long and float and doubles and ints. It'll just automatically do it for you. So that's pretty much it. Okay. So now some bigger things. We have array. These are not primitive. These are more these are built off of other data types. So an array is a collection of a data type. Think of it like a list, like a list of variables. Now, when you get to Java, there will be differences between arrays and lists. But in JavaScript, every single array is pretty much just a list of variables. So you can add things to the bottom, you can take things off, you can remove them from the list, and you can only store a single type of variable in an array, which is actually a list. It's confusing. So in case you don't know, or I'm assuming you don't know, a list is pretty much like an array is a set of variables, but there's a fixed size, while a list can grow and shrink based on how many variables there are in the list. So you'll need to know this distinction in Java, but in JavaScript, every array that you initialize is a list. Another one of these would be a tuple. So tuple, this is really only in Python, but a tuple is, I believe it is an array that you cannot modify any of the contents of. So once you have it in there, it's just set in stone. A string is an array of characters. You can use the quotes, the double quotes, to start a string, and it's really easy. Just type in whatever you want. You can have spaces, you can have punctuation, you can have text. I'm not sure if it supports emoji, actually. It depends. I think it might depend on what JavaScript version you're using. And it can be useful to store usernames. That's pretty much it. All the other entries require hashing and salting, which is pretty much just randomizing the numbers and letters in a specific way so that you know how to unrandomize them. So, yeah. String can store text. Conditional. So these are how we get into the logic of JS. So we have the variables, we have how to store data. Now we're going to learn how to process that data. So one way we can do this is using conditionals. So there are 3 types of conditionals. There's if, else, and else if. So an if statement says if x happens, then y. So if your number is equal to 3, then do other code. And else says if your previous statement is not fulfilled. So like if your if statement is detecting that a number is 3 and that number turns out to not be 3, then it'll execute that else statement and it'll do the code inside the else statement. And then else if combines else and if together so that if the first if doesn't work, then it'll move on to the second if, which is an else if statement. So like it's like if the first if is not fulfilled, then it'll move on. Then it'll do the next if statement. So the reason why we use else if and not just 2 if statements is because if you use 2 if statements, it'll actually execute both if statements. So if you're checking if the number is 3, and your other if statement is checking if another number is 5, if the number is 3 and the other number is 5, and it fulfills both if statements, then they'll both execute. And sometimes you don't want that to happen. So you want to use an else if statement so that it'll check the first if statement. If that is correct, then it will not move on to other if statements or else if statements. So logic gates. These are the very basics of logic in your computer and how your computer does processing. So, logic gates are the building blocks of your computer. Your computer is just pretty much made of a bunch of logic gates strung together to process things like addition, subtraction, moving around cells in your memory, and stuff like that. So each logic gate is represented by a truth table, which is this, which tells you, oh, wait, actually I'm getting ahead of myself. A logic gate pretty much takes in two inputs. They can either be 0 or 1, and outputs a 0 or a 1. So like here, I'm taking A and B and output Y. And they're represented in a truth table, which is pretty much this right here. Uh, so it tells you the inputs and what it outputs. So the first logic gate we'll be going over is the AND gate. And pretty much what an AND gate does is it checks if both inputs, if input A and input B are both 1, then it'll output a 1. But if one of them is 0, then it will not output a 1, it'll output a 0. And you can see that in the truth table. And how you use the AND gate in JS is by using and, the ampersand, which is just looks like this. You can type the ampersand by pressing Shift and then the number 7 on your keyboard. The OR gate. The OR gate sees if either input is 1. If either A or B is 1, then it will output a 1, and if both are 1, it will also output a 1. So if both are 0, it'll output a 0, and it is represented by the two absolute value signs. That's not LL, that is absolute value, which is usually it's right above the right enter. On your right side of your keyboard, there'll be an enter key, and it's usually right above that, not on the numpad, but on the actual keyboard. And right above that, you'll press Shift and you can type them. So the NOT gate. The NOT gate reverses in any input it's given. It only takes in one input and it reverses it. So if it's given a 0, it'll output 1, and if it's given 1, it'll output 0. And this works just like that. And how you write it is use exclamation mark. Now, there are other logic gates, such as NAND, XOR, and other things like that, but they do not have symbols in JS, and you have to string together and OR gates. For example, to make NAND, which is negative and, it pretty much means that if it's given two ones, then it'll output a 0, and all the other cases it outputs 1. So just reverse all these outputs. You can just attach a NOR gate to an AND gate to get negative AND, or NAND. Looping. Okay, so there are two basic types of loops, and then there are other more advanced loops that we will not be going into today. So a while loop executes while a certain condition is true, and a for loop takes in an initialization condition, which usually means you set up a variable. So for example, let I equal 0, and then an end condition. So when to terminate, for example, usually like when I gets to a certain number, and we call this variable I. It's just standard coding practice. You go I, J, and then K, and then L, and basically every time, and then you have a third statement. Every time it loops through, it can increment or decrement by a certain number. Usually it's by 1, and you just count. So this is a for loop example. This is some syntax. You see we can set up right here, for. We can set up the for loop. I equals 0 is when we're saying, okay, we're going to start a variable, I equals, which called I, and that's equal to 0. And you don't need the var right here because it's implied. And while I is less than 100, we will keep adding 1 to I every time we loop through until it is 100. So that's pretty much it for the slides that I have. But we did go over some other things in class, for example, functions. So what functions are is they are instructions that your computer can read. It's like writing down your recipes in a recipe book. Except you're writing code. So what you would use for a function is you'd use a code that you'd execute a lot. For example, if you're going to use a specific line of code a bunch, for example, let's say we need to have code that draws one black pixel every time you click or something like that. Everywhere you click, you might want to put that in a function so that you don't have to copy paste code all over your document. And the reason why we use functions that don't copy paste code, excuse me, is if you're copy pasting this code 100 times and you find one thing that's wrong in that code that you just copy pasted, you're gonna have to go through 100 different versions of your code and change it one by one. Well, if you have a function, it's stored locally. It's like having a big sheet of instructions, and then you have like the name, and then you tell your computer to run these instructions by saying, "Hey, run this function called print one black pixel onto the screen," and you just have to change it in that one place, and you're good globally. So that's why we use functions, and uh, I will show you the document that we did in class called my first script. Let's open up VS Code. Let me check that I'm still recording. Oh, okay, I am. That's good. So we can see that here we have a function. Oh, okay. We have a function called onClick, which will change text on the screen depending on when we click the button. So this function will actually be called right over here in the HTML by saying when we click this, call the function onClick, which will then run through all of this code. So this is why functions are useful. We could actually just paste the JavaScript code in here, but we don't really want to do that. One, it looks very bad, especially to your employers if you want to find a job in coding. It looks very bad when you just copy paste Java inside of these, or JavaScript inside of the HTML tags. It's called, I think it's called inline coding, and it's one of the big no-nos of coding in JavaScript, inline coding, because once you get a bunch of JavaScript, it starts getting very, very messy. So, excuse me. Okay, so where was I? Yes. So it looks very bad when you just code inline, as when you get a lot of JavaScript in your code, uh, and you just put it all in your HTML file. It gets very large, and you can't really tell what is what very nicely. So you see, we have our code nice and concise. Um, if I were actually doing a job, doing a professional level coding, I would actually separate this from the rest of my code. You don't have to worry about this. I would separate this from the rest of my code and put it in its own JavaScript file because just looks cleaner. And I'd also separate all my CSS into different files depending on what it's in charge of. But since we're just hobby doing a small application, and it's not massive, and we're doing this as a hobby, not really professionally where you're getting paid, and you want to do a good job, then it's okay if you be a bit looser. So you might be asking, we discussed all these types of variables earlier, but can I create my own variables? Well, actually, you can create your own variables. They're called classes, but how you use them is a bit different than using regular variables. So pretty much, excuse me, pretty much what we do is we say class, and then the name of the class, position, in this case, and then we can set up little mini variables. For example, we can have x equals 0, y equals 0, and these are just ints. And then we can create this variable. We can initialize our new variable by saying var position1, which is the name of the variable, equals new type of variable called position, which is initialized up here. And we can see that, actually, this should be position1.x. So, and you can see we can actually modify these x and y values, which are in here. So this new variable that we created has two integers in it, and we can modify these by saying position1.x, and dot means accessing inside. So inside of this class we have x. So or inside of this variable we have an x variable, and inside this variable we have an x or a y integer. So we can just modify these, and you can create big classes. You can even create classes with functions inside them, which is they're called methods. That's pretty advanced, and it is good for if you want to, like, say, create a shooter game and you want to draw a bunch of enemies to the screen. You don't have to code that individually, like have just copy paste that each enemy into the code. You can actually just use classes in a very tight, concise code. And again, if I were coding this professionally, I would move this class into its own folder or its own file. But now, since it's small enough that I don't need to do that, I won't. But it's just a usually good habit to get into. So to explain what we've done over here. So the first thing I covered was the var command versus the let command. So they're the same except for one thing, which is accessibility. So the let command only exists within where you made it. So for example, if I made the let command inside of this loop, let's say let x equals 0. Actually, yes. So I'd only be able to access it inside of this loop. If I went outside of the loop, I wouldn't be able to access x. So that is good if you want to have your variables exist where they are, and you don't want to accidentally modify variables outside of where they're created, because that could cause problems. For example, if you're creating like a first-person shooter game like, I don't know if you guys know these games, but CSGO or Call of Duty or Rainbow Six Siege or Valorant, if you want to have position variables, you might want to keep them inside of where they're created. Otherwise, you could accidentally modify them and have your players teleport all over the map, which is not good. Not good for a game. But that is why I prefer to use let instead of var. But if you do want to modify them in different places, you'd probably use var. But there aren't very many cases where you would use var over let. So let's talk syntax for functions. How you initialize a oops, I collapsed that. How you initialize a function is you just type function, and then the name of the function, and these parentheses indicates if it wants to take in a variable or not. So if you want to take in a variable, there could be a couple of reasons. For one, you might want to change the function's output depending on the input. So for example, if you want to check if a variable is true or false, and then do something else based on that, you have to take in that variables for your function to know if it's true or false. And then you can have a return statement over here as the output. We're not outputting anything because we don't need to pass it on to any other code in here. We just need to modify some HTML. So we actually don't need to pass anything on. But if you would, you just type in return and then the variable. For example, this could be like x. Doesn't actually exist, but as an example. And then it'll pass it on. And you could do something, for example, you could do, let's say, var func output equals on click, and that would say what it returned would be recorded as a variable. So now you could pass information from the inside of the function to the outside of the function, which is pretty useful. Actually, it's very useful. You have communication between these different bubbles inside your code. So yeah, that's pretty important to know. What we did over here is we implemented the if-else statement. So we have a variable called toggle, and it starts off as false. And the reason that we can see that they can see what toggle is over here is because toggle is created inside the parent of this function, which pretty much means that if you use the let statement, you can go from outside in, so you can go from like out here inside the function, inside this little bubble, but you can't go from inside the bubble outside to the global code. So that is a nuance with the let statements that is an important distinction to make. And then we check if toggle is true. After we click the button over here, then it will change the text to this, but if toggle is false, it'll change the text to this. So you pretty much, and it'll turn toggle, if it's false, it'll turn toggle true, and if it's true, it'll turn toggle false. So pretty much what this will do is it will pretty much just make a toggle button that'll toggle the text every time you click the button between these two. So some things we could do to improve the code is we could actually get rid of this equals. Oh yeah, awesome. there's different equals. So equals, this one equals, equal sign means you're setting it to false. So uh, you're turning this into false. You're turning toggle into false. But if you use three equals, it means you're checking if it's false or checking if it's true. So, and then two equals would be something in between the two, but it has different edge cases. For example, it's like checking, but it's if we had like var x equals 0, and we have var x, so the integer and we have the character. If we just use two equals, then it'd say that these two are the same thing, but they're obviously not. One's a character and one's an integer. They're stored differently, but if you use two equal signs, that will be counted as the same, and you really don't want to do that. So this is why we use three equal signs. But we could actually get rid of all this. We can just use that. So that's a shortcut that you can use in code in JavaScript. If toggle. So this pretty much says if toggles equals true, or if toggle is true. But this works too. And if you wanted to say if toggle is false, you just do exclamation mark toggle because of the not gate. So that also works. But yeah, that's pretty much all that we covered in class. If you have any questions, DM me on Discord, or send a message, uh, and or ask me in the next class too. I uploaded this pretty late, so yeah, I will see you guys on Friday, I guess.